Here is a pink ink by Sailor Manyo Sakura. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
In first looking at this in the sample vial, I thought, oh no. And seeing it right now, you may be thinking the same thing. Oh no. As a pink, this is a bit of an orange kind of a lean. Maybe. This is a tough ink to fully classify. It does change colors as it dries on the page, thankfully. Now, there's a ton of tone variation by pen, and it takes the right pen to be able to really get an appreciation for this ink. I don't have an appreciation for this ink, as evident by how short this video is. But don't skip it. Make sure you check out the writing sample done with the wet fine. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average.
The pen for today is an Aurora Optima.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is hard to look at even after it's dried. It's just so light, and it's really coming through much more as the yellow that I saw in the vial. Very unreadable. It's shading, sure, which only makes it look like there's dark spots on the paper. Looks like ink bled through and was touching this page a lot. It's frankly gross. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. Thank you, because I was very worried about what we're getting here. Now, it's a whole lot darker than any of the other writing that I've had. In fact, as a pink, when it's going, we really start to see that kind of red lean. Now, we do get some shading, if you see it in others on the first line, where the O is lighter than the THE and it lightens up at the RS. And you get the same thing at GOT, where the G is lighter at the top than it was at the bottom. The O lightens up and the T gets very dark. I think what we have here is a good one from this nib. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit lighter than it was with the wet fine. A little bit darker than it was with the soft fine. We can tell that it's a pink. We can more or less read what's there after it's dried. Hard to keep track of, really, because, boy, this is light. Now, we get no feathering. We get no spread. You could tell I'm a little out of practice. The first time I've done that one. That's a great thing that we don't have those, and I'd be surprised if it happened on this paper. We do get some shading. Help on the first line. Starts as a nice mid-tone with the HE, and I wouldn't mind that if it was the tone most of the way. The L lightens up a bit, and the P gets very dark. Not a lot going on that I can say especially positive here. Looking at the broad nib, you would really think I have different inks in here. I don't. This is a kind of golden yellow that we're getting. It didn't dry into that pink, which is why I said it's hard to classify. Now, it's darker than it was with the medium, lighter than it was with the wet fine, a hair darker maybe than the soft fine. No feathering and no spread. Yes, we get some shading and some color variation. I still think this is basically a disaster. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Not a real shock there. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is light and unreadable. Now, this is a much more absorbent paper, usually does help bring up some of those colors in being more absorbent. Not so here. Technically, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, which is good news there. Bad news, it's hard to read. It's bad. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, but I would assume if it was, it would be hard to even see. We do get moments of shading. If you look at light on the third line, the downstroke of the L into the I and the T are darker. Yeah, but most of the words hard to read. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. It's lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Sorry, it's a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. I'm looking at them side by side. It's just a tad bit darker. No feathering and no spread. There is slight tone variation that's going on about what's happening here. And if you look at about, the beginning of the A is darker than the bottom of the A. It gets very dark into the B, lightens up into the OU, much darker at the T. I really do like what I'm seeing here for the ink's performance from this pen. I could probably deal with this as a tone a little bit lighter and be much happier. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the soft fine. We really do get a pink that's happening here. It's darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get some shading that's fairly decent. A majority of the writing, as I'm looking at it after it's dried, not just what you're seeing in the video, is pretty readable. I say a majority, not all of it. This is not going to be one of my favorite inks. Looking at the broad nib, it is just as dark as it was with the medium. A little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Believe it or not, that's not a good thing. There's no feathering or spread that you can tell, but it's so light, I don't know if you would be able to tell. We get moments of shading, and those moments of shading make you feel like, hey, maybe it bled through from the page underneath. It didn't. This is actually just what it is on the page. Not a pleasant experience. Looking at the back of the page, we get some good news as we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Though, strangely, I do see a little bit deeper into the paper on the medium nib. Shocking, honestly, considering how light this ink was. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Ackerman, their number 20. Here is Diamine Pink Glitz. Here is Lamy Vibrant Pink. Here is Thornton's Pink.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Birmingham Pen Company Waterford Dusk. Here is Kaweco Pearl Black. Here is Noodler's Beaver. Here is Robert Oster Graphite.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The soft fine is very dry as a pen and really brings out weaknesses of an ink, and it did it here. It's unusable as a tone. Now, thankfully, the wet fine is much darker and is the best tone that I got during these tests. Now, the medium is lighter than the wet fine and has really good shading that without the shading would be hard to see. Still hard to see. The broad gave the same tone as the soft fine, the same darkness as the medium, being really still unusable. It's pretty obvious that the wet fine performed best, but I would say that I would really recommend a gusher of a pen, regardless of the nib size, in order to get the most readable tone of this. Now, I understand a lot of people really do like gushers of pens, so it may not be any kind of a problem for you. Make sure you sample responsibly.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.